What's up, y'all? My name is Dan. South African Airways is a flag carrier of South Africa, and it used to be one of the largest and most successful airlines in the whole of Africa, but that's been changing in recent years. The airline has been going through a big downfall, and they've been struggling to turn a profit, so I'm going to get into what I guess would be the rise and fall of South African Airways, and why any sort of recovery attempt is not going to be easy at all. I should mention also that I'm going to try to avoid getting into the political aspects that have been plaguing the airline in recent years because it's a mess. And I'm mostly going to be talking about the logistics and other circumstances that would make any sort of recovery very difficult. So let's begin with a little bit of history and the rise of the airline. SAA was founded in 1934. They mostly only flew domestically at first, until the 1950s and 60s when the airline began flying into international markets like London, Perth, and New York, with stops in between, of course. They also flew to other destinations as well. The airline eventually began flying these longer flights non-stop, with aircraft like the Boeing 747 SP. So they pretty much became experts in long haul flying, with the conscious location being really far from some very important markets like Europe, the US, Australia, and Asia, as well as having to fly around Africa to get to Europe because of the bans that several countries placed on the island because of apartheid. While European airlines were able to pass through the continent to get to South Africa, but despite all that, the airlines seemed to be doing quite well. But it was in the late 1980s that SAA was banned in the US, Australia, and other international markets because of restrictions imposed in the country, and that affected the airline quite greatly. These flights though resumed in 1991 after apartheid ended, and the airline also began adding more destinations within Africa itself. It was a pretty extensive network at this point, I should say, but I guess in a way this is sort of where the downfall began. It was in 1991 that the South African domestic market was regularized. So in the 1990s, other airlines like Trek Air and Comair started operations in the country, regularly competing with South African Airways. So in 1994, SAA Express and Airlink were launched to take over some of SAA's domestic and regional routes and gain back some of the lost market share. And then in 2006, SAA launched their local subsidiary Mango to compete with other airlines in the country. They also joined Star Alliance in 2006 to solidify their international presence. And this is also when SAA began modernizing their fleet, introducing Airbus aircraft, including the four-engine Airbus A340. But despite all of these things, the airline kept losing market share, not just domestically, but also internationally, as foreign airlines began increasing their capacity and adding new flights into South Africa with more efficient aircraft and better cabin products a lot of the time. SIA's four-engine A340s were basically competing with other airlines' more efficient twin-engine aircraft like the 777 and more recently the 787s and the A350s. Many of these airlines also offer connections at their own hubs, while SIA mostly depend on local demand into these foreign markets with fewer connections in comparison. Not just that, but it seems like the airline had been accumulating a huge amount of debt since 1994, now amounting to over 3 billion USD as of 2020. While inflation and the weakening of the South African economy in recent years certainly didn't help either, especially when it came to fuel prices. Meanwhile, SAA, still being a state-owned airline, was very dependent on the government's decision, which also means that the government's corruption also affected the airline. Many bad decisions were made that really hurt the airline's stability, such as, for example, launching flights to destinations based on government interests rather than those that would make any sort of financial sense, such as those flights to Beijing. And so it was in 2011 when the airline made a profit for the last time, and it's been losing money every year since then. Several unprofitable routes were cut in around 2015, such as Johannesburg to Buenos Aires and Mumbai, as well as a flight to Beijing, which was then replaced by Air China's flight to Johannesburg via Shenzhen. It was said that the only profitable long-haul routes were Johannesburg to London and Perth, two very important markets for South Africans, Hong Kong, an important financial hub and a gateway into China and East Asia, as well as Frankfurt and Munich, two important hubs of Lufthansa that offer many connections from these cities. I do wonder why New York wasn't on the list of profitable flights. My guess would be the high cost of fuel in such a long flight. Fast forward to 2019, the situation was now so dire that the airline finally went into administration. It was said that Ethiopian Airlines was interested in the airline. The airline also received newer, more efficient Airbus A350s to replace the older, less efficient Airbus A340s. This was also going to become the airline's new flagship aircraft, which began flying to New York JFK in February 2020 with around 25% in savings in comparison to the less efficient A340. The A350 was also going to fly directly to Washington, Dallas, and Frankfurt as well. The airline was going to rise again, except it didn't. The pandemic happened less than a month after the A350 flights to New York began. The airline collapsed. They ceased all operations. They began selling all sorts of assets. SAA also got rid of most of their fleet, and they returned the A350s back to their lessors only months after their delivery. Ethiopia most interest in the airline as well, and the subsidiaries SA Express and Mango both suspended all operations as well. As a bonus, SA Airlink broke off from SAA to become an independent airline. There were proposals to even launch a new national airline for the country, but in the end it was decided to just relaunch the existing airline. South African Airways didn't fly for about 18 months. During this period, the airline changed owners. The Carso consortium bought a 51% stake on the airline, and the other 49% is still owned by the government. For the first time in their history, the majority of the airline isn't state owned. SAA resumed operations in September 2021, but the airline was a lot smaller than it was pre pandemic. As of 2022, the airline has around 9 destinations, including Cape Town, Durban, Maputo, Harare, Lusaka, Mauritius, Kinshasa, Lagos, and Accra. All of them from Johannesburg, although Maputo isn't flying at the moment. The entire long-haul network is gone, and their fleet is only about 7 aircraft. 3 Airbus A319s and 2 Airbus A320s for the short-haul flights from Johannesburg to Cape Town, Durban, Harare, Lusaka, Kinshasa, and Mauritius. 1 Airbus A330 for Accra and Lagos flights, and 1 Airbus A340 that's only been used once a week for the flight to Lagos. It's pretty obvious the state of the airline is really sad, only a shadow of its former self. And honestly, any sort of recovery attempt is not going to be easy at all. But why is that? Why do I think that SAA is very unlikely to recover from this anytime soon? Well, first of all, corruption. The airline's management will really have to change. But honestly, even without any government involvement, this would still be a hard uphill battle. You see, first of all, the airline has to become profitable again, or at the very least somewhat stable with the routes that they currently have, and this might not be that hard considering that SAA has a monopoly on many of their routes. While some are busy enough that they could turn a profit easily, but the big problem is going to be expanding out of these 9 destinations. To relaunch many of their former routes, the airline is going to need planes, and they are likely not going to be easy to get with the weak finances and the bad record the airline has. And even then, once the airline begins to add any routes, they'll have to face competition from other local airlines. Many former routes have been taken by other airlines, plus the airlines that were previously competing with SAA, such as British Airways, Lufthansa, or Singapore Airlines. And while analyzing the long haul routes that the airline used to have, I should say not a single one of these is likely to come back, in my opinion. The main reason would be because of the lack of wide bodies, but also because of other reasons that vary depending on the destination, such as London, where the airline has lost all of their slots and it has to face British Airways and Virgin Atlantic. Frankfurt already has Lufthansa on the route, so it can cover for the lost flight, while Condor is also entering the market. Munich might be better off being taken by Lufthansa. Hong Kong is flown by Cathay Pacific anyway, although heavy lockdowns and authoritarian measures in the city are not helping either. Perth would likely be taken up by Qantas for themselves in the not so far future. New York JFK would face competition from United's recently launched flights from Newark. When it comes to the flights to Washington via Accra, Accra has resumed, but the Accra to Washington leg has been taken by United. A direct flight to Washington is also unlikely at this point. Sao Paulo will likely be taken by Latam, which would offer far more connections. For now, passengers will likely transfer via Luanda. As we can see, many of these have already been taken, and others are likely to be taken soon. Most of them with a much more economical and efficient aircraft, and with a much better business model than anything that SAA has, especially with the connection that these airlines offer at their hubs. You also can't forget the airlines from other airports where SAA didn't fly to in 2019, such as Delta, Air France, KLM, Swiss, Turkish, Etihad, Emirates, Qatar Airways, Singapore Airlines, or Air China. And the airlines that also fly to Cape Town as well. And you also can't forget the African airlines themselves, such as Ethiopia and Kenya Airways, Egypt Air, TAG, Angola, Air Mauritius, and others that have taken a lot of their market into South Africa. SIA's future in the long haul market is basically crushed by other international airlines, but the short haul market isn't any easier actually. Domestic airlines are crushing SIA as well. Sure, the downfall of Comair has given SIA a little bit of breathing space in the domestic routes, but realistically it's not going to help much because SIA only has 2 domestic routes. But there's yet another problem that SIA is having to face as well, and this one is big. That is Airlink. Airlink is a small airline that became independent from SAA in 2020 during the pandemic. They changed their livery and also ended their franchise agreement with SAA. taking advantage of SAA's financial struggles during the pandemic to form its own identity separate from South African Airways. Airlink's been having many hostilities with SAA in recent years because of the lack of payments and the downfall of the airline that has been affecting Airlink's operations negatively. So far, Airlink has been very successful in detaching itself from SAA. They're basically doing whatever they want, adding flight frequencies and new routes. In such a short time, they basically became Africa's largest airline by number of flight frequencies and South Africa's second largest airline by passenger numbers. Airlink still kosher with SAA as well, basically letting them access the regional South African market. SAA has also kept a lot of their foreign kosher, but unfortunately SAA has been left to depend on point-to-point demand in pretty much all of their routes, because Airlink also began launching interline agreements with airlines that fly to South Africa, enabling Airlink to offer connections to hundreds of destinations all over the world. And it's paying off. Nowadays, over 20% of Airlink's passengers are thanks to these interline agreements, while Airlink offers connections for these airlines as well from their hubs in Johannesburg and Cape Town, as well as from Durban. Not just domestic, but also in nearby countries, reaching as far north as Entebbe in Uganda and to the island of St. Helena via Walvis Bay, offering far more connections than South African Airways. Airlink's fleet is composed by only regional aircraft that are smaller and easier to fill than those that SAA has. They allow for more frequencies, higher load factors, and profit margins of their flights. These include 6 BAE Jetstream that are set to be phased out soon, 4 Cessna 208B operate for lodge-link services, 17 Embraer ERJ-135s, 11 Embraer ERJ-140s, 3 Embraer E-170s, and 16 Embraer E-190s with one order that are used for some of their busiest and longer flights of the airline. When it comes to fleet renewal of the airline, there's nothing official as of yet, but in the future there could be a possible order for the Embraer E-2 aircraft that has a longer range and could save a lot of money in fuel. But that's not for certain as of now. Airlink seems like it's going to keep growing in the country, but especially in the international markets due to the collapse of SAA and Comair. But we could probably see more routes being added in the near future for Airlink, especially if they end up ordering more aircraft like the Embraer E2s, and we can also expect more interline agreements for them, as they basically become the main airline of choice for South Africans and set themselves up for a great future. And while it's fairly obvious that the situation for South African Airways is not really stable at all, the airline can't just keep losing money, and they can't keep getting bailed out over and over again without a change. And honestly, at this point, the airline should just look to be a stable, self-sufficient airline and avoid being dependent on the government's taxpayer money to survive as a brand. They say they'll add more destinations depending on market conditions, and I think a few destinations might be added in the future within Africa itself, but I really think that the only way for the airline to grow once again to its former extent is probably for the economy of South Africa to grow and become more stable, and especially to replace older aircraft to cut down on maintenance and fuel costs, but that doesn't really seem like it's going to be coming anytime soon. Hopefully things will turn out for the best for the airline, but I really don't think that the future is bright for them at all. But it is for Airlink, at least for now. Thanks for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any comments, questions, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. That's all I got to say, and I'll see y'all later.